One of the biggest changes when transitioning from Natsci to ChemEng is going to be the significant decrease in contact hours you're going to be getting. So when I did Natsci, I must have had around 30 contact hours per week, including 10 weekly lectures, the 2 or 3 weekly practicals, and the 4 weekly supervisions. For ChemEng, you still have around 10 weekly lectures, but thankfully no Saturday lectures and no 9 a.m. lectures, which is great. You have 1 weekly lab every other week, which is only 2 hours long. You'll also probably have 1 or 2 supervisions per week, but supervisions tend to clump together a bit around midterm, so these can go up to 6 per week, and they're all 1 hour long as well, same as first year Natsci. In Michaelmas and Lent, there's also computing classes, but you can do them at home and just come to the sessions to get them ticked off. Or if you do need help for some of the sessions, you can come. There's also 4 engineering drawing classes you have to do in Michaelmas that last 4 hours each. So I'd say all in all, you probably have around half the contact hours compared to first year Natsci in your first year of ChemEng. On the other hand, when you do have practicals every other week, you have to write a report on your findings, which takes up a lot of time. So this can take upwards of 10 hours, but you should manage your time properly, and although many Natskis pride themselves on being perfectionistic, there's no point sending in something that you've spent 15 hours on. So in terms of workload, I'd say there's half the amount of contact time, but significantly more work to do on your own, which leads to a slight increase in workload compared to first year Natsci. There are significantly more lectures in third year, so that's second year chemical engineering, but only 1 practical. They also have the tea break between lectures, which is a nice way to talk to others and have a break from lectures. In terms of difficulty, I actually found first year Natsci more challenging than first year ChemEng, but I guess it depends who you ask. So I took the classic Phys Natsci choices: chemistry, maths, materials, physics, and I found physics really challenging of the 4. I could barely pass a physics tripos question come Easter term, but compared to this year, I'm finding the material definitely less conceptually difficult, and I think the tripos questions as a whole are a bit easier.
So for engineers transitioning to ChemEng, the workload in terms of number of hours put in per week is a bit higher, but can definitely be managed. The biggest difference is that there's a lot more coursework compared to first year, whilst contact hours are more or less similar. So in Michaelmas, the workload in terms of lab reports is quite high. You'll have a ChemEng lab every 2 weeks and a chemistry one every week, whilst in Lent, you'll only have a ChemEng lab every 2 weeks. The key thing is to make sure that you don't spend a ridiculous amount of time on these lab reports. So the chemistry ones are very similar to standard credit, so only pass or fail. There's quite a big variation as to how much people write, and towards your last chemistry lab reports, you'll tend to find what the bare minimum is for you to pass. The ChemEng lab reports require a bit more work. However, I wouldn't recommend spending more than 10 to 15 hours on each one. You'll also have computing classes, which are very similar to first year, and exercises every 3 weeks, which Tom will explain later on. The latter are usually quite time consuming, and especially in Michaelmas, it's important to manage your time well with all these lab reports. So there's definitely a lot more coursework and independent work expected from you. So in terms of example papers, the workload is fairly similar. You get a couple of example papers per module that are released during the course of the lectures. You'll tend to have 2 to 3 supervisions during the week, and you'll most likely be paired with other ex-engineers from your college or another college. With regards to difficulty, it's definitely a step up, but definitely manageable. Since students come from either Natsci or engineering, the first few lectures were always revision ones to ensure that all the students were at the same knowledge level. So you'll definitely have time in Michaelmas to adjust the new department and meet all the other ChemEngers. So even though the workload is a bit higher, it isn't thrown at you at the same time, so you gradually get it set, so it can definitely be managed.
There is no mandatory preparation that first years need to do before starting ChemEng, except maybe if you did bio-Natsci or if you didn't take chemistry last year. But your college will probably know more about that than I do, and they'll definitely contact you and tell you in advance, so I wouldn't worry about it. The first few lectures anyway of each lecture course tend to just be recap lectures to bring everybody up to speed. That's not to say, however, that preparation won't make the transition to Chem-Eng any easier. So if you're coming from Natsci, you might want to read up a bit on some basic fluid dynamics and recap on your thermodynamics and materials course E, so that's mechanical behavior, the one everybody hates. You might want to recap those notes if you still have them, and if you took the courses, obviously. You might also want to get familiar with AutoCAD, that's a drawing software, and Unisim, which is a process design software. You'll be using this during the computing exercises, but obviously if you can't get a hold of them, don't worry, everything's taught during the computing exercises. If you still have your MATLAB booklet from the scientific computing course in first year Natsci, I'd recommend keeping it because it's really useful for some of the computing exercises, and if you've forgotten all the MATLAB commands and scripts or whatever, it's really helpful to just have a read and refresh your memory.
So in terms of preparation for the engineers, I think Luke covered most of it, but I've got two personal recommendations. Firstly, if you did A-level chemistry, I'd personally recommend bringing those notes to uni. I had a read of those relevant chapters before our chemistry convergence lectures, and it was quite helpful. It just made going to lectures a lot easier. However, I really wouldn't worry too much, as lecturers do go over basic principles. My other personal recommendation, which was given to me by my DOS, is that since most Natscis had done MATLAB in first year, getting a grasp of MATLAB prior to term, especially since like Python or coding just isn't my forte, made completing the computing classes in Michaelmas and some of the exercises in Lent a lot easier. Like, you don't need to spend a ridiculous amount of time on it, but a couple of hours learning a bit of MATLAB before Michaelmas will probably make your life a lot easier. There's also some prep you could do which may make the transition easier. The modules that overlap between first year engineering and second year are mainly thermodynamics and thermofluids, though there's a bit of structures too. So rereading those notes or making sure you understand those modules well could help you out.
So far I've covered a lot of the academic stuff for Natsci, transition to Chem-Eng, and Nikki will have covered a lot of the engineering related stuff, but there's a lot of other stuff you might want to consider. So firstly, lectures are unfortunately in West Cambridge, so you might want to consider buying a bike. Alternatively, the U-Bus is a bus service that runs through central Cambridge and drops you off right outside the department. The ride costs £1 though, and the bus timing is known to be a bit dodgy. You can obviously walk if you really want to, but it's a half an hour walk from Market Hill, so you'll probably have to get up a bit earlier. You can have lunch in the department, or bring your own lunch if you have to stay because of lectures or practicals. There's a public fridge and plenty of microwaves and cupboard space if you decide to bring your own food. Lunch from the department is pretty good, and there's a wide selection of food and drink. Also, there's a good selection of pastries in the morning if you didn't have any time for breakfast. In terms of the social aspect, Toby will probably comment more on this, but I'd suggest attending as many social events in the first few weeks of the new term as possible, so you can get to know many of the other chemical engineers, especially since you're all coming from two different courses, Natsci and engineering, which are both very big and you might not have had the opportunity to get to know them last year. So some of these events might be organized within your year group, or you might decide to come to some KUKAS events such as the first year's pub quiz, which has free pizza.
While Chem-Eng combines the knowledge from all sorts of different subjects, I would say that if you love learning about the sciences behind chemical reactions, chemistry may be more for you. Chem-Eng applies to large-scale productions, and a lot of the content that we study is based on problem solving, learning about processes and the safety and economic factors that come with producing a product on a large scale, rather than learning about the scientific theories. I couldn't really compare Chem-Eng to the subjects in natural sciences, as they all have bits in them that are useful.
I know that a handful of people in my year group did bio-Natsci in the first years, and overall they've not found the transition particularly more challenging than the rest of the cohort. You'll find that Chem-Eng is more like chemistry in the way that the course is taught than the more biological courses that you would have done, such as biology of cells. But having done cells, for instance, gives quite a big advantage over the phys Natscis and engineers, since the knowledge is pretty much the same for the biotechnology course in your first year of Chem-Eng. But do bear in mind that Chem-Eng is obviously more mathematically heavy than the bio-Natsci modules, as Arwa will explain in the next question. I would also like to point out that an incentive for doing Chem-Eng might be that we barely have to write as many essays as a typical bio-Natsci, and instead have problem sheets to work through in our spare afternoons. On the whole, Chem-Eng is more multidisciplinary, as you can still stay in touch with the biology and chemistry that you've learned in your first year if you wanted to, and you will be equipped in the end to make the decision of whether you want to go down a more biological route or not.
It does not matter what subjects you've chosen first year, as long as you've done the Maths A or B course. Maybe speak to your DOS if you are interested in doing Chem-Eng, but you have not done the mathematics course in Natsci. It varies from college to college on what combinations are preferred, but I think any combination is okay. So first year physics is not essential. If you've not done A-level first year physics, it should be okay as long as you've studied the Maths A or B course, but speak to your DOS again if you have any concerns. There is a part of the course where they do teach dynamics from first principles, so you would not be disadvantaged if you did not do first year physics. But I would suggest refreshing your memory on basic concepts if you're worried, although it's not essential. The course is mathematical, but you do not need to learn any rigorous proofs, and a lot of the equations are in the data book, so you do not need to learn many equations. The skills you have gained from the engineering course and the mathematics A or B course is more than enough to be fine in chemical engineering.
Technically, you can swap to chemical engineering in October, but I definitely recommend doing it in advance so you know what exactly you'll be doing next year. I think many of the decisions are made in the last few weeks of Easter term after exams, and also after receiving exam results.
Coronavirus will change things, so we have no idea how much you'll see people from other colleges, but in the past, generally speaking, yeah. Most colleges only have a few Chem-Engers, so there's plenty of inter-college socialising. A few colleges might have a notable number of Chem-Engers, in which case they may end up sticking together more. But you'll still have plenty of opportunity to get to know other people, because there's normally 20-minute tea breaks between your first and second lectures, which probably won't happen in Michaelmas, but hopefully in the other terms will. There will also be plenty of QCAS social events, even with social distancing. We'll try our best. Something to also note is that year sizes in Chem-Eng are much smaller than Natsci or engineering, so how sociable a year group is will vary quite a bit from year to year, so nothing's guaranteed.